Hello, and welcome to Drucker Forum TV. I'm Mary Meaney, a board member and social entrepreneur, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome our guest today, Teresa Amabile, Professor Emerita at Harvard Business School, and a pioneering, groundbreaking researcher who's done some truly amazing work on creativity, motivation. You may have read her book, The Progress Principle, and most recently, who's embarked on studying retirement. Her latest book, Retiring, Creating a Life That Works for You, is going to be the focus of our interview today. Teresa, thank you so much for joining us on Drucker Forum TV.
Mary, I'm really delighted to be here with you.
So, Teresa, let's start. I'd love to understand what sparked your interest in studying retirement.
Well, you mentioned my prior work, reported in the book, The Progress Principle. And it was really that. It was one of our findings in that book that led me to this interest in studying the retirement experience. As you might recall from that earlier work, my co author, Stephen Kramer, and I discovered that people do their most creative and productive work on those days that they have positive inner work life. And positive inner work life is simply having the most positive emotions at work, the most impressively strong connection to their team and their organization, feeling that they have a good impression of their team and their organization and even themselves, and when they have the strongest intrinsic motivation, and that is being really jazzed about their work. Those are the times when they do their most creative and productive work. So the next question we asked in that research was, if positive inner work life is so important for creativity and productivity, what is it that leads to positive inner work life? And we found that of all the events that can happen at work that can lead to positive inner work life, the single most important is simply making progress in meaningful work. So we had a lot of implications of that finding in that book for leaders, for managers, and for people working in organizations. But there was one implication that kept nagging me that we didn't enjoin in that research. And that is, all right, if meaningful work and making progress in meaningful work is so important, what happens psychologically to a person when that meaningful work comes to an end? And many professionals, maybe even most professionals, do find meaning in their work and do feel that they are making at least some progress in their work each week. So, what happens psychologically? What happens with people's relationships? What happens to the structure of their life when that is coming to an end?
What a fascinating question. And so, as part of this latest research project, you then did an extensive amount of interviews and case studies. So, tell us a little bit about what you found when you studied retirement.
So, yes, we did interview 120 people at different career stages for this research, but we focused primarily on the 83 older adults that we interviewed, some of whom were still working, hadn't yet made a decision to retire, some of whom had already retired when we interviewed them, and 14 of whom we call our stars because we feature them very prominently in our book. These are people that we interviewed repeatedly as they went through the retirement transition. We were in the fortunate position of catching them. We were recruiting for our study just after they had made their decision to retire, but they were still working. So we followed them through the ending of their career and going through the retirement transition, that last day of work, and then living their first few years in retirement by repeatedly interviewing them. And that allowed us breadth by interviewing so many different people, 120 in total, but great depth by looking in detail at the stories of these people's lives, their thoughts, their feelings, their experiences, their decisions as they went through the years of that retirement transition. And our main finding, oh gosh, I don't know if I can give you one main finding, Mary. I'm going to give you a few if that's
Please
okay.
do. Share some of the key findings as you did this fascinating research. What did you learn?
Well, one of the most surprising things was, we think that when we're retiring, that means we're going to stop working.
Mhm.
But one of our discoveries was that it actually takes work to stop working. There are 4 tasks that we discovered that people have to engage in if they want to have a smooth transition to a satisfying retirement life. The first of those tasks is simply making the decision to retire, which might sound straightforward, but it can be very complicated for many people, especially professionals who have been deeply engaged in their work and closely identified themselves with their work or their career. The second task is detaching from work, tangibly, of course, handing off your remaining projects and wrapping things up, but detaching psychologically, which can be a lot more difficult, we discovered. The third task is exploring and experimenting with elements that you might want to incorporate into your retirement life structure. So we call this building a provisional retirement life structure. Your life structure is simply everything in your life: your activities, your relationships, the organizations and groups that you belong to, the places where you spend your time. And the fourth stage, the fourth phase, the fourth task is consolidating a retirement life that has a more or less stable rhythm and routine that works for you. So going from those provisional elements and deciding, all right, what is working best for me, and consolidating your retirement life around that. These don't necessarily happen in the same sequence for everyone, but we found that everyone does have to engage in these tasks. Another key finding: there's no one right way to do it.
It's absolutely fascinating. Now, as you know, Teresa, we're at the Drucker Forum, and the overall theme for our conference this year is about advancing knowledge work. So I'd love to hear about what you see as the biggest risks and also opportunities for knowledge workers in particular as they face retirement.
I'm so excited to be speaking with you at the Drucker Forum because everyone we studied in this research on retirement was a knowledge worker. Some of them were very high level managers, actually operating at the very top of their organizations. Some were individual contributors, and we had managers at all levels in between. So I think that the greatest risks when knowledge workers are approaching retirement come not so much from the financial security risks. Of course, most people, except the ultra wealthy, do worry about finances as they're approaching retirement. You don't know how long you're going to live, and you don't know what's going to be happening with your investments. But the people that we studied were at least reasonably financially secure. So that was not a top of the mind concern for them. The biggest risks we found were that they lacked awareness of self. And by that, I just mean they weren't deeply introspective and aware of their most important identities, especially if they identified closely with their work. They may not have realized how important their other identities were for them, such as grandmother or community volunteer, social entrepreneur, as you are. Many of these people, all of them, had multiple identities when we asked them about their identity. And yet they weren't keenly aware of that. They weren't keenly aware of their most important needs and priorities and values at this point in life. Many of them kind of still thought of themselves as they were in their youth or at middle age, and weren't clear eyed about who they were now and what they really needed in their life. And they also tended to lack clear awareness, some of them, of their life structure and the dynamics within it, and how that life structure was affecting them, and whether or not it aligned with who they were now, with that self that existed right now. So that's why the subtitle of our book, the main title is Retiring, but the subtitle is Creating a Life that Works for You. So developing that awareness is very important, and you often can't do it alone. You need a trusted other person, a friend, a therapist, a spouse, perhaps an adult child that you can talk to about yourself and your life structure as you're approaching this transition.
It's really fascinating. Um, Maybe just to probe a little bit further, as you did this research, were there any surprises? Were there any things that you expected to find that you absolutely didn't find, or things that really popped up that you hadn't expected?
Okay, so I'm going to make a confession here. You might notice I have some gray hair. I was approaching retirement myself when I started this research 10 years ago, and I just finally retired a few months ago. And all of my colleagues, my four colleagues, Lottie Balin, Marcy Creary, Tim Hall, and Kathy Cram, we were all either approaching or recently transitioned into retirement. I was hoping in my heart of hearts that we would find a silver bullet for retiring, that there would be, okay, 3 steps that you need to follow, and then it'll all fall into place for you. Well, it was a surprise, perhaps, but maybe we should have expected it, that there was no silver bullet. We actually saw many different paths to satisfying retirement lives, which I guess is good news. So that was one surprise. Another surprise is that many people expected to maintain their work relationships after they retired because these had become really important to them in some cases. In some cases, they had worked with the same people more or less for decades. They knew them, they were very friendly with them, and they assumed that those relationships would continue. And yet, in many cases, maybe most cases, the relationships didn't continue, at least not to the extent and the closeness that they had been. And that was not only a surprise to us, it was really a surprise to the people themselves when they looked back on it and said, wow, I thought I'd be seeing those people more frequently. I thought we'd be talking more frequently. And there was some communication in most cases, but not to the extent they expected. And yet, most people in our study did develop nice, rich relationship networks after retiring, partly by nurturing existing relationships that they had in their personal life, but also by developing new relationships and sometimes rekindling relationships, even going back to their childhood.
That's really interesting, Teresa. No silver bullet, but you did outline and you do outline in your book some advice about what people should think about or start preparing. And I'd really love for you to share, what are some of the pieces of advice you'd give to people at different stages? So well before they actually plan to retire, when they're close to retirement, and maybe also in the first few months once they've actually taken that step and retired. What advice would you give them?
Wow, those are great questions. I would say think about these 3 things. Think about identity, which I've already talked
Hmm.
about. Try to develop a good, realistic self awareness. Think about relationships. Even if you're young, of course, you need to identify with your work. You need to kind of throw yourself into your work. But are there other identities that are important to you that you want to hold on to and develop? Relationships. Think about, who do you want to grow old with in your life, among your colleagues, among your family members, among your friends, and focus on nurturing those relationships. And in terms of life structure, so that's a third thing I would say, think about your life structure. What are the activities that you might want to introduce into your life that could be a foundation for an exciting, interesting, fulfilling, meaningful retirement life? Even if you're young, you can start exploring activities that you might one day want to invest a lot more of your time in when you have more time after you retire. We have 4 A's for people to kind of help them remember how to do this. Would you like to hear them?
Absolutely, please.
So the first is alignment. Work toward alignment between the self you are and your life structure. And by the way, this is good at any time of life, not just when you're retiring. And if there isn't good alignment, and by the way, you need that second A, awareness, which I talked about before, awareness of self, awareness of life structure, to figure out if they are well aligned. If they're not so well aligned, the third A is agency. Proactively undertake one or more changes in your life structure, possibly even in yourself, if there is something that you'd like to develop about yourself. And you could do anything from a minor tweak in one aspect of your life structure to a major change like removing career from your life structure or completely restructuring career so that you're doing something else or you're spending less time at it. And the fourth A is adaptability because, we cannot control everything in our lives as much as we might like to believe that we can. And it's very important when something happens in our life structure or in the wider world, like the pandemic, that we cannot control. We have to learn to adjust and adapt to it.
Teresa, thank you so much for all of your insights. There's no silver bullet, there's no single path, but the 4 A's that you just outlined around alignment, around awareness, around agency, and around adaptability will definitely stand us in good stead. So thank you for joining and for all of your words of wisdom. We really appreciate it.
Mary, it was delightful to talk to you. Thank you so much.